Peter from the Psycho Chicken Eco Farm here. We're going to be talking about cover crops today, and behind me, not what I would consider a cover crop, but sort of some hedgerow, beneficial, wild areas. This is just a tiny little pond that I dug. We've only, quote unquote, lost about 10 by 10 square foot or 100 square foot area, but I'm sitting here listening to the frogs jump in and out of the pond and toads, and it's surrounded by goldenrod and some common asters. I've got a little bit of milkweed planted around it, and I'm not sure if you can see it behind me, but it is just teeming with insects. Tons of beneficial wasps. The honeybees are loving everything over there. We've had a bunch of monarch butterflies come in, and their caterpillars have eaten most of the leaves off of the milkweed. They've since crawled up onto the side of the barn and gone through metamorphosis and are flying back on their way. So it's a great way to just have little wild spaces close to your crops where the toads can get out and eat the bugs that you don't want, and the beneficial insects can come in and take care about the caterpillars that you want. All of the ladybugs and praying mantises can come in and eat the aphids and things that you don't want on here. Anytime you can get your farm closer to a sustainable ecological system that mimics what nature does on its own, the less work you're going to have to do trying to suppress the bad bugs or fertilize your soil or things of that nature. When you let nature work for you, she'll do a great job. Cover crops are great for regenerative agriculture, especially if you're working in a no-till context, but you can manage them in a conventional tillage context as well. I want to talk first about the benefits for your soil, for weed suppression, for growing your mulch in place if you use mulch in your farm, and then I want to talk a little bit about management. So let's get started first on the benefits for your soil. So how do cover crops benefit your soil? Plants not only collect sunlight energy to grow and set seed, but they collect an excess and frequently exude that excess as sugars into the soil from their roots, encouraging microbial biological diversity in the root zone of your farm. This, of course, they're not doing for free. They know that those bacteria and fungi are going to come in and break down other things around them that they need. So you have a little soil microbiome in there that's supporting your plants. Some plants also fix nitrogen from the air, usually through a cooperative arrangement with bacteria in your soil. Most of the legumes will create little rhizomes or small spherical structures on their roots that are colonized by bacteria that can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere into available nitrogen that the plants can use directly. So by planting cover crops, you're essentially getting free fertilizer for your farm. Some cover crops can actually sequester minerals from deep in the soil and bring them up into the root zone to make them more available for other plants. Borage is a good example of this as a mineral sequestering plant. I believe alfalfa does to some degree. Of course, the comfrey plant is another good one to sequester minerals. And many of the broadleaf, large taprooted weeds that we don't want in our farms can also sequester quite a bit of minerals and help break up hardpan if you have that in your soil by sending that taproot down. So not everything that you might think of as a weed is perhaps as detrimental as you suspect. Of course, keeping cover crops on the soil helps preserve the soil structure. Having bare soil, it's vulnerable to the sun, the wind, and the rain, which can break up the surface, wash it away. You might get a hard crust up there if it dries up too much. So by reducing the impact of raindrops through the leaves before the rain hits the soil directly, you reduce that impact erosion, which is a critical component of washing things away. When you keep cover crops on your farm, you produce habitat for beneficial insects. Only 2% of insects are known to be agricultural pests. This is from the Xerces Society. So when you spray an insecticide that's broad spectrum, which essentially all insecticides are, you're going to kill 100% of the insects on your farm, when you really only want to get rid of 2%. For beneficial insects to want to be on your farm, You want to create a habitat that will support both the, quote, good and bad insects. Most predator insects that eat the bad bugs that we want to get rid of take a little bit more time to get established on your farm. So you have to have a population of the bad bugs around before the predators are going to move in and start to control them for you. So if you're using a chemical method or some other method to kill insects on your farm, you're actually setting yourself back a lot further than you might want to, because there's a lag time before the predator insect population builds back up. This is a great thing to have cover crops on your farm and windrows that you can just let be wild, because leaving the stalks up over the winter creates a place for the insects to lay their eggs or to overwinter, and in the spring they'll come out and start going after your bad bugs right away. Of course, depending on the type of cover crop you plant, you could also be attracting pollinators to your farm, which will then help get you better production. Having pollinators around to pollinate any flowering crop that you have can really boost your yields, especially in strawberries and squash, cucumbers, things of that nature. Another great advantage of having cover crops on your farm is that you can use them to suppress weeds. Now, if you're in a no-till context, using deep mulching and compost, you're probably not going to have that much of a problem with weeds to begin with. But having cover crops in the soil, you can use them as in-place mulch that you grew right there, didn't have to bring in. I love to use winter rye as an example of this. By planting winter rye in the fall, right now is a great time in our region. We're here in Asheville, North Carolina, 7A, or I think just zone 7. This is the 1st of October, and we're planning on planting our winter rye right now. It's a little bit late. Some people like to do it a little bit earlier, but with climate change and increasing temperatures, we found that this is a fine time to plant winter rye as a cover crop. So that'll stay in the soil all winter, be green, be supplying the soil microbes with energy from the sun that it's converted into sugars for them to eat and thrive. And then it'll grow up tall in the spring, and right before the seeds become viable, what some people refer to as the milk state, you can either crimp it down, scythe it down, weed eat it, or mow it, and that'll kill the plant, leaving those roots in place. Those will break down, more microbiology will come in, they'll provide channels for your crop's roots to run down quickly and absorb all of the nutrients that are left over from those roots. So it's a great cover crop to use over winter. Another great thing about winter rye is its allelopathic effect. It exudes chemicals into the soil that actually suppresses the growth of other plants around it. It takes about 2 weeks after you terminate your winter rye for that to go away, and then you don't have any problems planting other crops. But it'll keep the weed pressure down by suppressing other plants from coming up while it's living in the soil. Buckwheat is another great example of this. It's a really quick growing crop. It'll go from being seeded to flowering in less than a month in the middle of the summer. It has some mild allelopathic effect. Bees, pollinators absolutely love the flowers. And it jumps up so quick, it shades out a ton of the weeds that might otherwise come up in a bed that's not being used right away, or you just want to let rest. Growing your mulch in place is a great way to reduce the amount of work that you have to do and provide cover for your soil that you can transplant or hand seed directly into. Winter rye is especially great for this. Just look at all that biomass that you didn't have to bring into the field. And you can crimp it down and plant direct into it, or if you want to really make sure you get a good kill on your cover crop, just cover it for 2 weeks in the summer, and when you pull that tarp off, it'll be ready to plant directly into. There's a super thick thatch that helps conserve moisture, protects the soil from erosion, while suppressing weeds that would otherwise come up in bare soil. Not to mention creating great habitat for all the micro and macro flora and fauna that you want in your field. From the snakes and turtles all the way down to the spiders, weed seed eating beetles, fungus, and bacteria that work together as a complete micro ecosystem to support the field crops that you're growing. From a no-till regenerative agriculture standpoint, it almost doesn't get better than this. Let's talk a little bit about managing your cover crops. how to get them seeded, grown up, killed, and dealt with so that you can plant again. For seeding, I like to just broadcast my seed. This works great for winter rye, buckwheat, clover, many of the little flowering cover crops that you want to use. You do lose a little bit as far as your germination rate goes, so you do have to seed it a little bit heavier than you would if you have a seeder that can drill through, in a no-till context, whatever you're planting into. But it still works fine, especially if you can rake it in a little bit and time it so that you can either water it in really well or seed right before a rain. As far as prepping your soil for this, you can, of course, mow down whatever's there, till it, and then use your preferred seeder to get it in there depending on what cover crop you're planting. For the smaller seeds, I almost always just broadcast it. Any of the clovers, crimson clover, white clover, Dutch clover, red clover, those I just broadcast out. Buckwheat is another great one to broadcast out. The clovers I don't even rake in. The buckwheat I'll rake in a little bit to get it started. For the winter rye, same thing, broadcast it and give it a rake if you're tilling. If you're not tilling, you can just mow down whatever you have in place and then broadcast on top of that, or crimp it down. There are some considerations both with dealing with your cover crop before you plant and before you seed your cover crop. At our farm, we have a lot of reptiles that we really try and protect: snakes and turtles. Turtles primarily are really difficult to take care of, and it pretty much prevents us from using any mechanical steel-bladed mower in the summertime, anywhere from early March all the way through late November. So I try and use these practices pretty much in this order. We'll crimp, use a scythe if I need to, use a weed eater next, and then only in the wintertime when all the reptiles are hibernating will I get out a mower and mow it down, which is it's a sacrifice because it's so easy to just run a flail mower down something, but that kills everything in its path. You also have to consider not just larger animals that you might be killing with your cover crop or weed management. Even a weed eater really is devastating for a lot of larger spiders and beneficial insects like praying mantises and things. So whenever you go through, be conscientious about how you're going to terminate it. One thing that I've found works really well if you can have the time to plan ahead and do it is if you crimp down your crop or your cover crop and then tarp it with a silage tarp for about 2 weeks is all you need in the summertime to really kill everything under there. And that gives all the little critters a chance to crawl out from under it. This has been something we've employed here at the farm that's worked really well, surprisingly well, even for fields that we've let gone fallow and had what some people would think is a horrible mess with perennial and annual weeds coming in. Just cover it. Crimp it down, cover it for up to a month, pull it off, plant right into the mulch that's in place, even if it's just a weed mulch, and your weed pressure subsequently is really low and the plants grow great, especially after you've let your field rest for a year and then prepped it by leaving all that organic matter in place before you plant. Thank you all for watching, and in closing, I just wanted to add that it's important for us as stewards of the land to keep ecological sustainability in mind when we're working on the farm. If your focus is just profitability, eventually that model is going to fail because the soil needs all of the creatures that support it for the soil to be able to support you in growing food. So think ecological sustainability as much as you can in your farm operation. And with that, think about where this land has been. Sort of in tradition of the Cherokee, think about your ancestors and where they came from, and then how this land was managed before we got here. We are essentially living on land that was stolen from an indigenous people. And the more we can put into our mindset and practices the way that they worked the land, which was based on ecological sustainability, the better off we're going to be. So honor the history of the place where you farm, the people that used to occupy it, and the methods that they use to keep it sustaining them and the creatures that live on it.